Hey guys, tonight we begin with a journey not into the gilded halls of kings or the thunderous clash of knights on the battlefield, but into the quiet, desperate heart of the medieval world. We begin with the remarkable lives and the almost unbelievable resilience of medieval peasants, the everyday, anonymous heroes who, despite all odds, managed to survive some of the coldest and most brutal nights in recorded history. Their story is not one of glory or conquest, but of grit, ingenuity, and a stubborn refusal to surrender to the dark. From makeshift insulation tricks that would make a modern engineer weep, to communal sleeping strategies born of pure necessity. Their tale is a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit. So, before you get comfortable in your centrally heated home, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're retuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the globe. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. When you think of medieval life, your mind might conjure images of jousting knights, grand feasts in stone castles, and merry fairs alive with music and laughter. But for the vast majority of people, upwards of 90% of the population life, was a far cry from a storybook. For the average peasant, winter was less about merriment and more about a single gnawing question that echoed in the wind. How do we not die tonight? This wasn't just a season. It was an annual antagonist, a recurring test of endurance that arrived every year. Like an especially cruel teacher who didn't believe in second chances. And the winters they faced were not the mild, predictable seasons we know today. Many historians believe this period fell within a climatic downturn known as the Little Ice Age, a time of advancing glaciers and significantly colder temperatures across the northern hemisphere. This wasn't just a few extra frosty mornings. It was a fundamental shift in the climate, turning already difficult winters into life-threatening sieges that could last for months. Rivers that were once navigable trade routes froze solid for weeks on end. Crops failed in the fields before they could even be harvested, and the very air seemed to crackle with a hostile, biting cold that felt personal. Picture this. You are living in a tiny one-room hut constructed from a lattice of sticks and a charming mixture of mud, straw, and animal dung. The walls are so thin, you could probably hear a bird sneeze from the field outside. There is no insulation as we know it, and the only windows are small. Square holes stuffed with a piece of animal skin or a bundle of rags to keep the worst of the wind at bay. There is certainly no thermostat to argue over with your siblings. The inside temperature of your home is usually just a polite couple of degrees above whatever the weather is doing outside. If it was freezing outdoors, it was politely slightly less freezing indoors. Congratulations. Nights were the true test. Darkness, absolute and profound, swallowed everything. The wind howled through the cracks in the walls like an angry ghost, and the fire in the central hearth sputtered pathetically. It did its best, but mostly just managed to roast the toes of whoever was sitting closest. If you were on the other side of the room, you might as well have been camping outside, but with worse snacks. Clothing wasn't much help either. Peasants didn't own fancy fur coats or goose-down blankets, yet a couple of rough-spun wool tunics, maybe a cloak that smelled suspiciously of goat, and a desperate hope that layering them would turn you into some kind of human onion. Spoiler alert, it didn't really work. And forget about snuggling under soft quilts. Beds, if you could call them that, were often nothing more than coarse sacks stuffed with hay or straw, maybe with a few old rushes thrown in for good measure and, as a bonus, a thriving community of fleas for extra company. Luxury, thy name is medieval peasant life. This relentless cold wasn't just uncomfortable, it was lethal. Frostbite, hypothermia, and the simple, brutal act of freezing to death were constant looming risks, especially for the very young and the elderly. Every morning that you woke up still breathing was considered a minor miracle, but honestly, worth celebrating perhaps with a slightly less frozen turnip for breakfast. So yes, surviving a medieval winter was an epic struggle. It was about gritting your teeth, piling on every piece of cloth you owned, huddling with your family and livestock, and praying you didn't wake up with icicles hanging off your eyebrows. And the real adventure was just beginning. If you think your apartment is drafty because the window doesn't close properly, medieval peasants would like a word. Their homes weren't just drafty. They were basically very enthusiastic wind tunnels with a roof. Most peasant houses were what historians politely call Wattle and Daub construction. This translation is simple. Sticks wattle were crisscrossed like a giant basket to form a frame, which was then smeared with a charming plaster daub, made from a mixture of mud, straw, clay, and animal dung. Yes, dung. They weren't trying to be gross. Dung was a cheap, sticky, and surprisingly effective insulator that helped bind the mixture together, unless it was always readily available, shall we say. Building a home was a communal, seasonal affair. Families would work together, packing this odorous mixture into the wooden frame, smoothing it with their bare hands. But no matter how lovingly smeared, these walls didn't stand much of a chance against a proper winter storm. The cold wind, a relentless predator, found every crack, every gap, every microscopic imperfection.
It gleefully
Danced its way into the one-room homes. It swirled around the floor, making sure you never got too comfortable, never forgot the battle raging just outside. Privacy? Absolutely not. Warmth? Not really. Character building?
definitely.
Then there were the roofs. Thatched roofs woven from bundles of reeds or straw. Looked picturesque in paintings, but after a few months of rain and snow, they became heavy, sagging liabilities. They leaked, they rotted, and they occasionally let in the local wildlife. Nothing says a pleasant evening like a squirrel, displaced from its frozen nest, dropping onto your dinner pottage. Windows, if they existed at all, were laughably tiny and usually covered with thin, oiled animal hides, wooden shutters, or simply stuffed with rags. Glass was so astronomically expensive that even the lord of the manor probably couldn't afford more than a single tiny pane for his chapel. Peasants were just happy if the wind didn't rip the cowhide right off the wall mid-blizzard. To make matters worse, the floors were often just compacted dirt. When it rained or snowed heavily, moisture seeped up through the ground, turning the floor into a cold, muddy mess. So technically you could say they had indoor water features, not that they appreciated it. In winter, every step inside your own home could feel like trudging across a frozen marsh. Cold from below, cold from above, cold from all sides. It was a three-dimensional assault on your body heat. But medieval peasants weren't the type to whine. They were masters of the makeshift solution. They packed gaps in the walls with moss and dried grass. They jammed old rags into the worst drafts. They huddled close to each other, human insulation at its finest. Creativity, stubbornness, and perhaps a bit of sheep grease rubbed into the walls were often the only things standing between them and becoming medieval popsicles. Because if your house was falling apart, and your best protection against the elements involved mud and goat hair, well, at least you could laugh about it. Sort of. If your teeth weren't chattering too hard. So if the freezing air wasn't enough, medieval peasants also had to battle a silent, insidious enemy rising from below. The frozen ground itself. Floors weren't really floors, in the modern sense. They were just slightly flatter patches of earth that happened to be inside your home. Maybe, if you were lucky, someone had thrown down some straw or old rushes to give you the illusion of comfort. But make no mistake, you were sleeping one insulted back away from the cold, hard dirt. And oh, that cold was relentless. It seeped up from the earth like an evil little ghost, worming its way through the straw into your bones and straight into your very soul. If you dropped anything onto the floor during a winter night, a wooden spoon, a piece of bread, congratulations, it was now part of the permafrost. Medieval peasants tried to fight this grim battle in a few ingenious ways. One method was layering thick mats of straw across the floor. If you could afford it, tore more realistically, if you could sneak enough of it from your neighbor's field without getting caught, you might have a decent insulating barrier. But straw flattened fast under the weight of a family, got moldy even faster from the damp ground, and added an extra crunchy soundtrack to your already miserable nights. Some homes layered dried rushes onto the dirt instead. Every so often they would throw fresh rushes on top without cleaning out the old ones. Over time, this created a fascinating layered ecosystem of decomposing plants. Fleas, food scraps, and whatever mystery creatures decided to move in. It was basically medieval carpet padding, if your carpet was alive, slightly damp and smelled like a wet dog. Beds, for those who had them, didn't solve much. They were usually little more than crude wooden frames packed with you. Guessed it, more straw or hay. Instead of cozy mattresses, you had poking, shifting, crunchy layers that did little to stop the cold radiating from below. tossing and turning wasn't about finding a comfortable position. It was a desperate, awkward dance to keep blood flowing and avoid freezing one side of your body. The truth is, medieval peasants didn't conquer the icy ground so much as learn to live uncomfortably above it. A good night's sleep wasn't about dreams or softness. It was about waking up with all your toes still attached. If you could pull that off, hey, you were doing better than most. If medieval homes had a single hero during winter, it wasn't the roof or the walls or even the brave layers of dirt and dung insulation. It was the hearth, a crackling, stubborn fire pit that served as the only real defense against the cold, the darkness, and the general gloom of medieval life. At the center of nearly every peasant home was a simple fire. There was no fireplace with a fancy stone mantel, no neat chimney sweeping the smoke skyward. Instead, you had a basic pit dug into the dirt floor, or a pile of stones, some half-burned logs, and enough smoke pouring into the room to make you wonder if you were slowly becoming a ham. That's right, most homes didn't even have chimneys. Smoke just kinda did its best. It drifted out through small holes in the roof, cracks in the walls, or right into your lungs if it was feeling lazy that evening. It wasn't ideal for breathing or your overall lifespan, but on the bright side, it did a great job of fumigating fleas and other unwanted guests. Who needs pest control when you're marinating in smoke 24/7? The hearth wasn't just about warmth either. It was the kitchen, where a single pot of pottage might bubble away for days. It was the only light source after the sun went down, casting flickering, dancing shadows on the walls. Sometimes it was even the medieval version of a television. People sat around the fire, telling stories, gossiping, or just staring into the flames because, frankly, there wasn't much else to do. Keeping that fire alive wasn't just a nice idea. It was a mandatory life-force duty. Letting the fire die out at night was like putting up a sign for the cold to come in and finish you off. Plus, reigniting a fire in winter wasn't as easy as striking a match. You had to work with flint and steel, desperately trying to coax a spark onto a piece of dry charcloth or tinder, and then tenderly nursing that spark into a flame with whatever dry kindling you hadn't already burned. Everyone in the family had a role, stoking the flames, watching the embers, adding peat, sticks, or, if you were lucky, a precious piece of dry wood. It was a constant battle between human persistence and the smothering cold that wanted nothing more than to snuff you out. The hearth didn't guarantee survival, but without it, survival was downright impossible. It was a smoky, sputtering, often disappointing little fire, but in the depths of a medieval winter, it was the beating heart of hope. If there was one thing medieval peasants feared more than running out of ale, it was letting the fire go out overnight. Without that warm, flickering lifeline, the cold would creep in faster than a tax collector after harvest. And in the dead of winter, restarting a fire from scratch wasn't just inconvenient, it could be deadly. Matches didn't exist yet. Lighters dream on. Rekindling a fire meant striking flint and steel together, praying for a single precious spark, and then coddling that spark with tender love and whatever dry kindling you had deigned tea already burned days ago. Imagine trying to do all this in the freezing dark, half asleep, with frozen numb fingers. Now, add a hungry wolf, howling in the distance for extra motivation. So, peasants got smart. They banked the fire. No, not in a cozy savings account. Banking meant carefully burying the glowing embers under a thick mound of ash right before bed. The ash acted like an insulating blanket, starving the coals of oxygen just enough to stop them from burning out, but keeping them alive just barely until morning. If you did it right, you could stroll over at sunrise, poke the pile a little, add fresh wood, and blow gently to bring the flames back to life. Voila, fire without the frostbite. But if you did it wrong, let's just say mornings got a whole lot colder and a whole lot grumpier. Fire banking was an art passed down from parent to child, like a prized family recipe. Everyone had their own little secrets and techniques. Some said to use dry ash only. Others insisted a bit of dampness was key. Some packed the embers tight. Others let them breathe. You could practically start a medieval argument just by suggesting a better firebanking method. It was the ancient version of arguing over barbecue techniques, just with slightly higher survival stakes. Sometimes banking the fire wasn't enough. A howling wind might sneak through a crack and snuff it out anyway. Or a clumsy sheep might stumble into the hearth. Yes, it happened. That's why some families took turns getting up in the night to check on the coals, a medieval equivalent of sleepwalking to the thermostat. In the end, fire banking was less about mastering nature and more about buying just a few more precious hours of warmth. And if you woke up to even a single surviving ember, that was your victory right there, enough to face another day of battling the cold. In medieval times, the phrase "the more the merrier" wasn't just about parties. It was a winter survival tactic. When the fire sputtered and the freezing winds whistled through every crack in the walls, there was one surefire source of warmth: each other. And if that meant sleeping cheek to cheek with your entire family, a few neighbors, the family livestock, and possibly a very confused goose, so be it. Forget about personal space. Privacy wasn't even a concept. On the coldest nights, the goal wasn't comfort. It was don't wake up frozen to the floor. Entire households piled into the warmest corner of the house, usually the one farthest from the door and closest to the lingering warmth of the hearth. Wrapped in whatever scraps of cloth they could find, they formed what could best be described as a desperate, snoring human lasagna. The arrangement was strategic. Younger kids were squeezed in between their parents. Grandparents, with their thinner blood, snuggled under the outer layers. And if Cousin Ethel showed up unexpectedly seeking shelter from the storm, well, there was always room for one more. If you were lucky, you got to sleep in the middle, where body heat radiated from all sides. If you were unlucky, you were on the edge, the medieval equivalent of sleeping next to the door of a meat locker. And woe to the person who moved too much during the night. You shift once to get comfortable, and suddenly you've knocked Aunt Mildred into the freezing draft by the wall. Congratulations, you're now the family villain. Sometimes even the bedding was shared, a single communal straw mattress that slowly flattened under the nightly weight of multiple generations. And because hygiene wasn't exactly winning any awards back then, let's just say it wasn't the most fragrant sleeping arrangement. But hey, when it's you versus frostbite, you stop being picky. Body heat wasn't just nice. It was a calculated strategy. Some medieval guides even recommended deliberately arranging the strongest, warmest people on the outside of the group, like human shields against the cold. Babies and frail elders were tucked deep in the center, treated like the precious little heat generators they were. This wasn't just about survival, though. Over time, it became part of daily life, part of family bonding. Long winter nights huddled together led to storytelling, singing, and undoubtedly some very interesting conversations muffled under a shared wool blanket. So next time your sibling steals your blanket or your dog hogs the bed, just remember, at least you were not fighting for elbow space between a snoring uncle and a particularly judgmental goat. If you thought modern roommates were a challenge, medieval peasants would like to introduce you to their winter housemates: cows, goats, pigs, and chickens. Basically, anything with a pulse and a little bit of body heat was invited inside. Bringing animals indoors wasn't just a quirky village tradition. It was a vital component of survival. Livestock generated a surprising amount of warmth, and in a poorly insulated hovel, where the wind howled louder than your stomach, every little degree mattered. A full-grown cow is essentially a slow-burning, four-legged furnace. Plus, if your goat shared a wall with you, it was slightly less likely to get stolen by a desperate neighbor in the dead of night. 2 birds, 1 stinky stone. At night, the one-room house became a chaotic living furnace. Chickens nested in the rafters, or in baskets in the corners. Pigs snorted contentedly near the hearth. And the cows, the MVPs of indoor heating, often lounged luxuriously against the walls, chewing their cud like they paid rent. It wasn't glamorous. Far from it. If you've ever been stuck in a car on a summer road trip with someone who forgot to shower, imagine that, but it's a cow. It's winter, and there's literally nowhere else to go. The smells were legendary. By springtime, the accumulated perfume of a shared winter was something fierce. You didn't need to light a candle. Your nostrils were already on a wild ride. But medieval peasants developed a selective nose. They didn't complain much because they knew one uncomfortable truth: the more animals inside, the fewer frozen toes in the morning. Certain animals even had prime spots. Cows, being the biggest and warmest, usually took center stage near the family's sleeping area. Goats were allowed closer in for their warmth, and because goats being goats, they would find a way inside anyway. Pigs didn't care. They plopped down wherever they pleased, probably right in the middle of the floor. Of course, Sharing your bedroom with livestock wasn't without its hazards. Imagine drifting off peacefully, only to be rudely awakened by a chicken deciding your hair makes a good perch, or stepping barefoot into something suspicious. First thing in the morning, as medieval mornings could be full of surprises, still, despite the noise, the smells, and the occasional hoof to the ribs, peasants understood the simple math: cold kills, and cows cuddle whether they want to or not. In the battle against winter's icy fingers, a warm, slightly slobbery cow's breath was often the deciding factor between life and death. In medieval winters, fashion wasn't about looking good. It was about not dying. Peasants weren't flipping through the latest trends. They were layering up like they were preparing for battle against the grim reaper himself. The rule was simple. If you owned it, you wore it, sometimes all at once. First, the basic undertunic, a scratchy, probably not a too clean linen shirt. Over that, a thicker woolen tunic, then another, if you had it. Add some leggings that sagged at the knees, a rough cloak draped over your shoulders, and if you were really lucky, a patched-up sheepskin thrown on top like a prize trophy. Congratulations, you are now approximately 10% warmer and 90% itchier. Boots were a luxury. Many peasants wrapped their feet in layers of cloth or old rags and stuffed them into wooden clogs or simple leather shoes. If the cold still bit through, well, you just added another rag and hoped you didn't lose a toe, and forget about washing all these layers. Washing your clothes in the middle of winter meant dragging them to a frozen stream, smashing through the ice, and then waiting 2 days for your only shirt to dry if it didn't just freeze into a tragic shirt cycle. Most peasants wisely decided that smelling like a mix of smoke, sweat, and sheep was a small price to pay for not freezing solid. Interestingly, the dirt and grease buildup had a bonus feature: insulation. That grimy layer of life locked in body heat and clogged the weave of the fabric, making it more wind-resistant. It was like a medieval Gore-Tex jacket, just smellier and far less socially acceptable today. Hats, scarves, and gloves were prized treasures. A simple woolen cap could mean the difference between making it through the night or waking up with your hair frozen to the wall. Gloves were often homemade from whatever scraps of leather or fabric people could scrounge, sometimes looking more like sad puppet costumes than anything fashionable. Children were especially swaddled until they resembled overstuffed turnips, waddling awkwardly around the house. The goal was to trap as much precious body heat as possible. Style, elegance, I never heard of them. Warmth was the real medieval flex. So the next time you complain about layering up for a chilly day, just remember, medieval peasants walked around wearing half their wardrobe at once, looking like lumpy laundry bags and counting themselves lucky for it. Long before electric blankets and fancy heated mattress pads, medieval peasants had to get creative if they wanted a little extra warmth at bedtime. And that's how the humble, ever-glamorous heated stone became one of winter's unsung heroes. The idea was pure, desperate genius. Before heading to bed, someone, probably whichever unlucky child lost the family argument, would grab a flat, smooth stone from near the hearth and chuck it right into the heart of the fire's glowing embers. After roasting it for a while, until it was nearly too hot to touch, a fine line between helpful and third-degree burn, they'd fish it out using a stick or some old tongs. The stone, now radiating a blissful, intense warmth, would be carefully wrapped in multiple layers of old rags or tucked into a worn-out piece of cloth. This primitive heating pad was then slipped under the hay in the communal mattress, or placed down at the foot of the bed, where it would wage a tiny, heroic war against the frozen earth. Of course, there were risks. If you didn't wrap the stone properly, congratulations. You now had a small, localized house fire smoldering in your straw bed. And if you dropped the hot stone on your foot, well, let's just say winter injuries weren't always caused by slipping on ice. But when everything went right, that stone provided precious, comforting warmth that could last for hours. It wasn't luxurious, but when you lived in a half-frozen hut, luxury was defined as not waking up with icicles dangling from your nose. This small act of ingenuity, repeated night after night in countless hovels across Europe, represents the peasant mindset perfectly. Face a problem, find a simple solution, and don't complain. In the grand arsenal of medieval winter survival, a hot rock tucked into some hay might not sound glamorous, but for peasants clinging to whatever heat they could find, it was a tiny miracle. When medieval peasants faced the merciless cold of winter, they didn't just pile on cloaks or stoke the fire. They prayed. A lot. Because when the wind howled like wolves outside your paper-thin walls and the fire shrank into sullen embers, you wanted every possible advantage, including a little divine intervention. Faith wasn't just a Sunday affair back then. It was woven into every frozen breath. Before crawling under layers of straw and scratchy wool, families would kneel together on the cold dirt floor, offering up hurried, asserted, heartfelt prayers to keep the fire burning, the roof intact, and their toes attached by morning. Saints became more than distant holy figures. They were winter's frontline defense. St. Nicholas, for instance, was called upon to protect households from sudden ruin during the lean, deadly months. Others were called upon to protect against throat ailments, not a minor concern when one deep mouthful of icy air could land you coughing up your soul. Superstitions wrapped themselves snugly around daily survival. Some families sprinkled a little holy water near the hearth before sleeping, hoping it would protect against evil spirits or, at the very least, mischievous drafts. Others marked doorways with blessed chalk after certain feast days, pleading for warmth and luck to find their way inside. Special vigil candles, often blessed by the local priest, were sometimes kept burning throughout the night. A single flickering plea against the cold, suffocating darkness. And, of course, no serious winter prayer session was complete without a few promises. Dear Lord, if you just get us through this night, I swear I'll be kinder to my neighbor, even the one who keeps stealing our turnips. Faith wasn't some abstract comfort. It was a daily, urgent conversation. The peasants weren't asking for luxury, just survival. Little heat, a little food, and one more day to muddle through until spring broke the frozen grip on their tiny villages. It was simple, raw hope, whispered into the smoky rafters, tangled in breathless prayers, and tucked under itchy blankets that somehow carried them through the endless, merciless nights of winter. For all the ingenuity, prayers, and stubbornness that medieval peasants threw at winter, the truth was chilling. Sometimes it wasn't enough, and when winter won, it didn't just take a few unlucky souls. It could take entire families, vanishing them into silence beneath a heavy shroud of snow and ice. Some winters were particularly cruel, like the infamous Great Famine winter of 1315, when relentless rains destroyed crops, livestock starved, and freezing temperatures turned an already brutal existence into a slow-grinding disaster. People were so desperate that stories whispered of eating shoe leather, bark, and, in the most horrifying cases, each other. Failure to keep the fire alive wasn't just an inconvenience, it was often a death sentence. Without the hearth's meager warmth, families would huddle together for the final time. In the spring, neighbors would sometimes stumble across whole households, their bodies still locked in one another's frozen embrace, as if trying to share just a little more heat until the very end. Houses themselves could collapse under the weight of heavy snow or battering ice storms. A roof giving way in the middle of a frozen night wasn't just catastrophic, it was often fatal. Disease loved the cold too. Starvation weakened the body, and the cramped, smoky homes turned into breeding grounds for pneumonia, bronchitis, and other deadly infections. A simple cough in December could easily be a funeral by January. And then there was the quiet horror of frostbite. Fingers, toes, even ears and noses would blacken and die while still attached to their owners. Some villagers survived the winter at the cost of their limbs, a grim badge of honor that said, "I made it through, but winter took a piece of me." What's most haunting isn't just the death, it's the eerie normality of it. People accepted that each winter some among them wouldn't see the thaw. Death wasn't unexpected, it was just another neighbor at the door, wrapped in frost, waiting its turn. When we look back at these medieval peasants, these muddy, frostbitten survivors of endless winters, it's tempting to see only their hardships. The cracked hands, the frozen toes, the smoke-choked huts. But buried beneath all that struggle is something far more powerful, a legacy of raw, stubborn ingenuity and unbreakable endurance. They didn't have central heating, thermal jackets, or cozy memory foam mattresses. They didn't even have the luxury of assuming they'd survive until spring. But what they did have, and what they left behind, was the blueprint for resilience. Every hay-stuffed mattress, every hand-banked fire, every moss-crammed wall gap was a testament to human creativity under extreme pressure. Faced with impossible odds, they didn't collapse in despair. They adapted. They learned from the land, from each other, and from the bitter lessons carved by each brutal winter. Their communities were built on more than shared land. They were built on shared survival. They understood that no one beats winter alone. Their blood, sweat, and ingenuity are stitched invisibly into the fabric of the lives we live now. Every cozy blanket, every warm house, every lazy winter evening spent under soft lights, all of it is the end result of countless medieval peasants simply refusing to give in to the cold. So the next time the wind howls outside your double-paned window, spare a thought for them. The nameless, fearless ones who turned shivering survival into a living legacy. One ember, one breath, one stubborn heartbeat at a time.